our station dealt with preparation and technical design of climate resilient infrastructure projects. We focused mostly on actually issues and technical issues. We didn't get as much into successes. I'm pretty sure there are many, and I welcome you to add some success stories when I'm done, because we didn't quite get to it. Like Faria said, we had a really rich discussion, multi-layer discussion. And it's very interesting to see how points that Peter Faria mentioned connected with technical aspects, and it came out in the discussion to show how interlinked these issues are and how we need to solve them in a more comprehensive and linked fashion. So again, we had rich discussion, and I won't be able to go back to each and every detail, but if you have questions, I can, again, like Faria was saying, I can direct you to the person who raised the issue. So in these 4 groups that came to our station, there are a couple things that kept on emerging, and that's what we tried to project here. The main issue, or one of the main issues, seemed to be lack of clear guidance on technical definitions and standards. Many groups said, what is resilience? Everybody defines it differently. Every financing entity defines it differently. So what are the projects supposed to do? For each specification, we have to go find different definition or adjust to different definitions. So that's a challenge. And there's also a need for technical standards. And we talked about technical standards being very stringent, and some said it was a requirement, it's a good requirement, but there's an opposing view where they said, well, if it's very stringent, then countries would find it difficult. It's another level of challenge that we're adding a barrier instead of enabling the environment. So the next was within the guidance and concept, to what extent is resilience? What extent of resilience do we need? And that's difficult. There are different categories of resilience, different categories of vulnerability. And when do we define a project as resilient? Do we know that, or is it standard? So that came out. Another point within this was in mitigation, use of technologies and leveraging technologies for mitigation is well recognized. Whereas in adaptation, recognition of technologies that are available and how to use them, the guidance is lacking. Whereas in every project, climate resilient infrastructure project, technologies will be needed and they'll need to be implemented, but how to do it and what are these technologies? It should be clarified and put in a guidance as well. And every team stressed the heavy requirement that's there for meeting the financial needs or proposals. There's heavy conditionality for financing. There are many criteria, whereas the guidance on what these criteria mean and how to actually meet these criteria is very, very limited. We also, I think somebody in our team mentioned, sometimes it's the guidance is so unclear that it's not written, but it's implemented. Somebody gave an example of co-financing. It's not a written guidance, but it's used very widely. So it's insane. So linked to this is also predictability of financing. There's a heavy requirement. Projects and teams tend to put in a lot of effort trying to meet this requirements and criteria, but by the end of it, the criteria are so heavy that the teams may not be certain that they will actually attain the financing. So there's always uncertainty and, well, we put in all this effort, what does it give us? So that's a barrier. In terms of country ownership, it is widely recognized that, of course, it's important, but while trying to meet this requirement, the ownership tends to get lost sometimes. And a very specific example was given. There's a logic framework, there's results framework that different financing entities put in place as a requirement. While trying to meet these results framework requirements, what's coming out from the local level, the requirements of the local level, the needs, adaptation needs of climate resilience at that level gets translated so many times to meet the results framework needs at a higher level that in the end the project starts to look different, and they may not actually address the actual needs that the project was trying to address. And another very common barrier was lack of information and data. It's interesting to note that it's not just climate change data that's missing, it's actually the basic data that's missing. We recognize that the countries that are most vulnerable are the poorest. And that's why they do not, most of them don't have the basic data that's imposed on them as a requirement for financing, requirements, right? We talked about how sometimes the baseline data that's required, the countries don't have it. So there's a need for the basic data, the status of resources, and how it will change over time under different climate scenarios, so that countries understand what they have right now and how it will change, so that they can decide on, that will facilitate decisions on what kind of climate resilient investments to undertake. We talked about data from different sources. It's very isolated. There might be project level data, or different ministries may hold data, but they're all different. They may actually have different methodologies and standards. So there's a need to harmonize data on climate change requirements, and also just basic land use and energy systems. So those were the two systems that came in our discussions, but I'm pretty sure the other sectors also, that harmonization and standardization necessary. So this goes actually, the third point, transaction costs required for these studies may go back to the heavy requirements for financing. In order to get the data and meet the requirements for financing, there's so much transaction cost needed that the project preparation becomes really difficult. And that's a large challenge for most of the countries. So even if there is some data, capacity to understand the data at the country level is missing, because climate change data tends to be very complex, and understanding how to implement it in a decision-making process is challenging. So there's going back to data versus service. There may be data available, but translation of that into a service. You may have water issues, but water data, a quantity of water, but how do you change it into a decision-making tool that's a service for agriculture sector or water sector is needed. Another point that was made was some countries actually do have capacity to understand the data, or may also have data, but the barrier lies in recognizing and identifying these data sources and capacity from international organizations and institutions that may oversee the capacity that's actually existent in the country. And another point is to recognize this talent and capacity within the country and help them enhance and sustain this capacity through projects. The last point is climate change. It is recognized that for climate change, multi-sectoral understanding and collaboration is needed. But at the same time, the data, going back to harmonization, sharing of data amongst ministries or sectors are missing. So decision-making and project development becomes very tough because resilient projects may require data from more than one ministry, and ministries are not sharing data. So that's a hurdle in itself. And also, not only horizontal, the vertical level, from local level to national. How do you share data and information on what's required and also what works, feeding back from national to local and local to national in decision making? So in a nutshell, this is what we discussed. And if there are more, I'm sure I've missed some, but if, I can point you to other colleagues that were involved in the group discussions.